Hey there, Mr. Terry here, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, I was about to cover a non-Israel Iran video to take a break from it. Then I saw Warfronts has done a follow-up episode. Now they put one out basically the day of or within probably 36 hours of the initial attack that Israel did on Iran. But they followed that up today with the video called Iran Has Been Abandoned. Here's why. And I wanted to cover this because I'm hoping this is some good context and maybe give me some opportunity to bring in some context to this conflict. And hopefully that's why you're coming here to the channel. What can we know about today's events and potential future based off of historical events? All right, this video will be linked down below. Make sure you're checking out Warfronts. I'll be back this weekend with some more of our regular history content. All right, hopefully you've been following my, I don't even know if I want to call it coverage, but my commentary, reaction stuff to some of these channels this week. In the last video, I had mentioned, because it's now been a few days in, the question about who is going to be helping Iran if it comes to that. And I'd mentioned how China and Russia have seemed to have put out statements basically saying Iran's on their own. And also talked about how the Arab world, and by that I mean some of the larger Arab states, have also had history with Iran, and not necessarily in the positive sense, which has led them to be isolated from the Arab world. Although there are smaller groups within the Arab states that Iran is very close with. But also remember, Iran is not Arab. They're also majority Shia. They're also majority Shia denomination, which has also caused some division, but that's not everything. But let's go ahead and take a look at what they got here, and we'll see what's up.
Here's how Iran's defense against Israel was supposed to work. All across the Middle East, year after year after year, Iran has sent weapons, funding, advisors, and more to a wide range of non-state actors with one shared enemy. From the Hamas organization in Gaza to Hezbollah in Lebanon to Yemen's Houthi rebels and more, all of Iran's allies were supposed to be so well armed, so formidable, and so downright unpredictable that if Iran itself were ever attacked, they would leap to the Ayatollah's defense and devastate.
That's the problem, because when you're talking about the internal allies that they have, like Hezbollah, Houthis, or Hamas, those are all groups that are already being engaged and are already being pushed to their limits. And Iran has done a lot more for them than they've, done for Iran. So I can't imagine what significant help they can do other than mere distractions. And I think there's a potential that Iran could kind of feel betrayed, maybe, if those groups can't come to help. By the way, today that I'm filming this is Thursday, June 19th. And as far as updates that have gone on today, one thing that's that you may have seen is some of the vulnerability in Israel for attacks. For example, a missile struck near a hospital in Israel that has upset them greatly, but that did show kind of a level of vulnerability that we're seeing in Israel that we have really not seen before in really the history, especially since like the 1960s, but especially since the Iron Dome era. Now, yesterday's video I was covering was from Caspian Report, where they're talking about the United States potentially getting involved. And the only real news that has come out, and I guess it is significant, is Trump has said he is, willing to get involved, but wants to be a little bit more calculated about getting directly involved. He said to basically within the next 2 weeks, basically wants to feel this out, and hopefully, he said, not be needed. The U.S. would not be needed. And it said that he has really tasked military advisors to see if what the United States could do would help or be worth it. Now, in the video I covered yesterday, one of the biggest potential needs, and it goes back to the goal of if they're actually trying to physically destroy nuclear research and processing plants around across Iran, is the problem that some of them are at a depth because they're built way deep underground. Israel does not have a bunker busting bomb that can get to the depth that some of these facilities are said to be in, and don't have the planes that can hold such. In fact, the United States is the only one that could do that. So that would be the potential. And I think what President Trump had said is want to make sure they do research that those bunkered bombs and stuff can even be useful. So there's some, I guess, cushion of time where the U.S. might get indirectly or directly involved. Now, I guess what could change potentially is providing more support for defense. I've also learned that ships are coming near the region. They've actually been there in the Mediterranean, but some, I believe, are coming up closer to the Persian Gulf that can do defense. You know, they on the Mediterranean, we have ships. The Americans have ships that can help intercept missiles headed into Israel. And that is one thing you may see continue while they're still trying to think about if direct attacks from the Americans on Iran is going to continue. But I guess what we would expect in the meantime is that you're still going to get retaliation ping pong between Iran and Israel. And again, both have shown some significant destruction. So anyway, let's get into this.
State Iran's mortal enemies, but right were attacked. So formidable and so downright unpredictable that if Iran itself were ever attacked, they would leap to the Ayatollah's defense and devastate Iran's mortal enemies. But right now, Iran is coming up on a week of continuous fighting with Israel, and Iran
Ayatollah is still saying,
on the
you know,
losing side.
Never going to give up, not going to surrender.
Of its own, but its military leadership has been decapitated,
not going to be
its air
pressured.
defenses are non-existent, and its people are at Israel's mercy. And all the while, Iran's friends across the Middle East have done practically nothing, watching silently as their longtime benefactor has been brought to the brink of collapse. So let's discuss just why Iran's friends have chosen this moment to bail out on their ally, and why Iran's decades-long effort to undermine Israel now appears to have been a waste.
Okay, this is great. As far as my goals, you know, for covering current events is hopefully to get the history, right? What have been the allies? Why have they been allies? And what could happen because of that? And why it could be a big deal. So we'll see.
Every end has a start, and for Iran, the cascading series of misfires and missteps that led us to today can be traced back to one of the most pivotal days in modern Middle Eastern history. October the 7th, 2023. That day, of course, is the day of the Hamas organization's massive assault on Israel, slaughtering about 1,200 Israelis, taking over 250 more
although
captives,
that was on
and kicking off the crisis that's now known as the
Hamas and Israel.
Hamas had long been reliant on the direct support of Iran.
This does affect
just
Iran.
Like every other group that we're going to discuss today, the relationship between Iran and its proxy force in Gaza was complicated. Iran certainly held a powerful sway over Hamas and could direct it to do one thing or another as Iran saw fit. But at the end of the day, Hamas was its own organization with priorities that could come into conflict with those of its main backer. By all accounts, Iran certainly didn't mind the idea of an October 7th style attack against Israel, but the way that the attack went down was far from what Iran would have drawn up. Hamas's rationale for the attack could make an episode all its own, so let us know if you'd like to see that. But for now, suffice it to say that Hamas perceived itself as being under threat from all directions, including from Iran. At that time, Israel was in the process of normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia, as Saudi Arabia was simultaneously normalizing relations with Iran. And in an Arab world where those three nations could start working together, Hamas knew full well that its mandate to exist could be under threat.
And that complicates things so much because you're in this tangle, web. Saudi Arabia, Iran had their differences and their rivalries for a long time, but that's, you also have the close relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. Last thing the United States would want is Saudi Arabia to come closer with Iran, especially, well, I guess it depends on what, closer diplomatic ties can look like. But again, the other, parts of the region, I mean, Syria is in pretty much ruins due to their civil war and the massive power vacuum is there. Jordan, know where Jordan lies, with basically largely supporting the West and not giving aid to like Palestine, for example, and has actually shot down Iranian rockets coming in. Then I guess the other ones you would look at is to the east of Iran. Okay, you have Pakistan, who's dealing with things with India right now, but there's also that, not a clear-cut relationship that you could probably expect major help. Afghanistan, I mean, they're completely trying to rebuild their country. I mean, it really comes to the non-Islamic countries when you really think about it that are potential help. But we'll see if he brings up like China and Russia.
A world where Iran and Israel eventually learn to tolerate each other or even collaborate, it would be Hamas left holding the bag after decades of death and destruction. Again, this is the quick version.
Well, and Hamas would be void of support, other than maybe some of the groups in Yemen. But like, yeah, not having that support, it would be very difficult for them to continue to operate with foreign support. That is, have to be on their own largely.
Events, and we can certainly decades of death and destruction. Again, this is the quick version of events, and we can certainly go into greater detail in a future episode. But in retrospect, the collapse of Iran's Middle Eastern proxy network started when Iran seemingly failed to anticipate that Hamas would attack Israel on its own terms without Iranian support, and had its own reasons for doing so. Before October 7th, Hamas was a critical part of Iran's plans to keep Israel in check. Hamas was thought to have well over 10,000 rockets and mortars at its disposal, plus several tens of thousands of fighters, long-range missiles, and kamikaze drones. Now, Hamas could, of course, use those assets to launch terror attacks, but they also served a dual purpose. If Israel ever considered taking military action against Iran directly, like Israel is currently doing, then it would have to plan for a major attack coming from Gaza at its rear. Even more dangerous.
And I believe that's happening right now, right? I mean, there's still a lot of, fighting going on. It's not like things have paused in Gaza, of course, but depending on what happens with Iran, that could also affect that as well. You know, the rhetoric that Iran, I think, has had against Israel and has also probably made them more distant from some of the other Islamic nations around there, and getting involved, if you really are going to try to hitch yourself to Iran, that it could tie you to conflicts that a lot of these countries have already, dealt with and have had to make deals to try to normalize things largely with Israel, and may not want to threaten that. So I don't think people want to, it seems like they don't want to tie their horse to Iran, even though Iran, again, is a powerful nation on that upper tier level of like Iran, Saudi Arabia, for example.
Was the Hezbollah for a major attack coming from Gaza at its rear. Even more dangerous was the Hezbollah organization based in southern Lebanon, who were estimated in 2024 to have anywhere from 50,000 to 200,000 fighters, up to 150,000 rockets, missiles, and drones, and other military hardware that led it to being widely regarded as the most dangerous non-state actor on the planet. Also,
and that could be one of the groups that could insert itself, of the smaller groups within nations. Hezbollah probably being the largest there when you're comparing them to like Hamas or the Houthis or something like that. Plus, there's already been a lot of problems, military action since October 7th with Hezbollah. So will they be willing to go in there as well? Also, though, could that then bring in also maybe the United States to get involved? U.S. didn't get involved when Israel and Hezbollah were going at it a few months ago, but I don't know. All right. Syria
led it to being widely regarded as
Assad
the most
was supported and he's gone.
actor on the planet. Also on Israel's border, the regime of Bashar al-Assad
That's
in
a big
Syria
hurt for Iran right here.
Close to Iran, allowing Iran to freely traffic weapons and fighters into Lebanon, and quite possibly contributing its own military assets in the event of regional war. But one by one, after Hamas launched its October 7th attacks, the dominoes, they started to fall.
Yeah. Even if Assad and that regime was still in power right now, they still would have been dealing with the coalition of groups that were fighting there, the civil war continuing on. I don't know what help Syria could have even, given Iran here. But like you're saying, movement of troops, like if you want to get to Lebanon and support Hezbollah, you go through Syria. Probably can't do that anymore, though.
First, Israel started a relentless air campaign over Gaza, followed by a multi-phase ground assault that still continues to this day. The number of surviving Hamas members at this stage is a subject of debate, but it's undeniable that their military strength no longer poses an immediate threat to Israel directly. Then, after almost a year...
I'm not like... I don't know, are you guys totally convinced of that, though? Especially if, the forces that are fighting with Iran, of course, are... aerial forces, so boots on the ground stuff still going on in Gaza, but can't imagine there can't be zero effect
military strength no longer poses an immediate threat to Israel directly. Then, after almost a year of low-grade fighting with Hezbollah to the north, Israel
everyone was just
rapidly stepped
watching
up its
that,
operations,
like knew it
detonating
was coming.
thousands of explosives, rigged electronic devices,
the phones.
assassinating key figures and invading southern Lebanon,
Remember that?
while dismantling much of Hezbollah's arsenal in the process. Then, in December of last
was
year,
nuts.
the Assad regime in Syria collapsed in the face of a lightning assault by domestic rebels who since made it their mission to root out Hezbollah operatives and Iranian smuggling lines that operate at cross purposes with the new government.
By the way, these are some of those connections with some of the Shiite groups that are minorities in all of these countries. That's where some of those connections do come from with Iran. But Iran being the only one that's really a Shia state as a whole.
And Iranian smuggling lines that operate at cross purposes with the new government. All right, now before we go any further, we've really got to put in perspective
I want to hear, though,
how
outside
important
of
those
the
changes were
Islamic world,
from
though.
both Israel and Iran's perspectives. Israel had long maintained that it would simply be too dangerous to launch a coordinated long-term air campaign against Iran by itself, declining to do so without American support for multiple decades, despite growing concerns over Iran's nuclear program. Hamas and Hezbollah would attack, Assad's airspace would pose problems at a minimum, and critical Israeli aerial refueling tankers wouldn't be able to fly safely unless Israel dominated the air corridor between itself and Iran. But now,
it largely
with Hamas
does,
and
it
Hezbollah
seems.
so badly diminished and Assad gone, Israel didn't face nearly as big of a threat in attacking Iran. Its
Right.
chances were made all the better when Israel took advantage of the collapse of the Assad regime to destroy much of Syria's military equipment, including aircraft and air defense systems. And
Have you guys seen too? A lot of the footage and evidence. There's a lot of stuff that it seems like in Israel is really being told not to be shown publicly. But like for example, you can see there's some of the footage of the intercept. You know, part of the Iron Dome is, the Iron Dome is it intercepts missiles coming in, so it launches things that blow up the rockets coming in, but some of those had misfired actually, and you can see some of the videos and things. And again, take everything with a grain of salt, right? We know things are maybe not always what they seem, but seems to be some instances where those have actually not intercepted incoming rockets and have actually landed and been destructive actually in Israel, some of these intercept missiles. So what do you call them? Salvos? But yeah, there has been kind of an attempt at locking down some of the footage and some of the things about devastation, in Israel. And that brought up an interesting point, by the way, an interesting question to ask. And it's because one of the things that people really want to know about, of course, are casualties, right? Everybody wants to know about casualties. And I was kind of thinking about this week. And if you're talking about Israel especially, is it more beneficial for the Israeli state to report high numbers of casualties and destruction, or is it more beneficial to try to report it on the lower end? Because if you think about it, there's kind of a pro and con to both. If you have it high, then it makes, Iran look bad. Maybe you get sympathy or something like that. But then if you have it, but having it high, though, the con, I guess, for Israel would be that it shows vulnerability. It shows vulnerability in Israel, right? But then basically just flip that with a lower version. So if it's a low number, okay, it shows, the helpful thing is like, we are, you can't hurt us. You can't do that. But at the same time, you wouldn't gain the sympathy aspect. So I don't know. What do you guys think about that when it comes to reporting numbers, and when is it beneficial to report high numbers versus low numbers? Let me know down below.
Destroy much of Syria's military equipment, including aircraft and air defense systems. And with the situation gradually shifting in Israel's favor, Jerusalem took it upon itself to mete out some proactive devastation. Some of that came against Iran directly, especially in October of 2024, when a massive Israeli air barrage crippled Iran's ability to produce new missiles and eviscerated its air defense systems. With those air defenses taken out, Israel put itself in a much better position to launch direct strikes on Iran later, especially because
Guess I never fully recovered from that either.
That were meant to protect critical military and economic targets. But just as important as that October attack on Iran was Israel's decision to step up air airstrikes against another Iranian proxy, this time the Houthi rebels in the nation of Yemen. By this time, the Houthis had made a name for themselves on the global stage, using Iran-supplied drones and missiles to attack maritime trade vessels in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Those attacks started just after the October 7th attack in Israel, and since early 2024, the United States has led a coalition air campaign to protect naval shipping and diminish Houthi capabilities.
Yeah, you've probably seen that. You've probably seen remember the airstrikes a few weeks ago that they plopped right down on what were said to be Houthi targets. But the big, I guess, problem for Iran is how much they can actually impact things. Like, one thing they're not going to be able to do to Houthis is, like, if the Americans are bringing carriers and battleships and stuff like that, can do very minimal damage, but some of the ships, like there's trade ships and stuff that come through the region, then that's what they have been a threat to. But like militarily, not much they can do there really that would be helpful. So
campaign to protect naval shipping and diminish Houthi capabilities. But when newly inaugurated US President Donald Trump came into power, America's air campaign against the Houthis ramped up exponentially. And starting this past May, Israel did the same. Israeli aircraft devastated much of the Houthis' infrastructure, its weapons manufacturing facilities, and its launch capabilities in response to repeated Houthi attempts to strike Israel directly over the past year and a half. By mid-June, when the Israeli strikes on Iran began, the Houthis had been largely taken out of commission, at least in the short term. And all the while, Israel and its allies kept up the pressure on other Iranian proxy groups. Of course, Israel's operations in Gaza have only continued, with Jerusalem now openly admitting that it intends for the vast majority of the Gaza Strip to never be resettled by Gazans themselves. In Syria, Israel still launches intermittent airstrikes, sometimes directly related to its occupation of a band of territory in the country's south, but sometimes against targets alleged to be Hezbollah or otherwise accused of arming themselves in a way that Israel finds dangerous. And speaking of Hezbollah, Israel has continued to carry out airstrikes across Lebanon, hitting the suburbs of Beirut as recently as just 1 week before the new undeclared war against Iran kicked off in mid-June.
I haven't heard a lot about that. I kind of thought things had cooled down a little bit with the Hezbollah situation, but it looks like I'm wrong about that. Maybe it's just because it's in smaller scale than it was before. But Lebanon and Israel have fought before over territories. Some of the more recent conflicts directly with Israel and their neighbors has been Lebanon.
Well, as alleged.
Lebanon's an interesting case too, because there's basically like multiple armies and like multiple governing powers. It's not a very unified state that way, and they kind of function despite that. But there are different like military and government groups that you kind of have to deal with, and both have different kind of feelings about affiliating themselves, whether it's Iran or more with the West. Lebanon's a very complicated situation inside because their lack of a unified structure.
Before the new undeclared war against Iran kicked off in mid-June, Israel has alleged that its strikes are intended to prevent Hezbollah from reconstituting, taking out its new senior leadership and destroying its capacity to build kamikaze drones. All right, so let's fast forward to the current conflict between Israel and Iran, starting on June the 13th, 2025. And at least one reason why Iran's proxy networks have waited to attack should be pretty obvious. That, of course, would be that they just can't. Hamas has practically zero ability to threaten targets outside of Gaza. Hezbollah has been ripped to shreds. Assad is gone, and the Houthis have been largely neutered in their ability to hit targets past the Red Sea. Iran's entire plan to deter Israeli military action by building up a network of proxy forces was predicated on the assumption that those proxies would be available to retaliate against Israel if Israel directly attacked Iran. But what Iran either did not account for or simply couldn't stop
really could have got out of that, though.
Would be able to target and dismantle Iran's proxies so quickly and in such rapid succession.
There's just no proxies that are on the level, even close to Iran. It becomes such a problematic thing for them, being kind of this island out there.
Dismantle Iran's proxies so quickly and in such rapid succession. But by itself,
and especially because they can't coordinate, they didn't, coordinate like an attack here. That was not it. I mean, remember they got attacked by Israel here, so they're in kind of defense mode. So it seems like the only way the Allies would have been, I guess, really that useful is if they had been on the offensive, but they're not. They're defending themselves here.
until Iran's proxies so quickly and in such rapid succession. But by itself, the diminished status of Iran's proxy forces can't explain the full story. After all, if these groups really are so committed to Iran's cause, then they'll launch what they have, even if they don't have much. And in truth, this already happens, at least to some extent. Since June the 13th, the Houthi rebels have targeted Israel with several ballistic missiles, although those missiles were either destroyed by Israel's air defenses or were allowed to make impact in open areas when nobody was at risk. In fact,
not going to do much.
Vowed to intervene more broadly in support of Iran, although, at least for now, it's unclear that they have any real ability to do so. Other groups, however, have chosen to simply stand aside. For instance, Lebanese leaders have been imploring Hezbollah to stay out of the crisis, and at least until now, Hezbollah has chosen to remain on the sidelines.
This is showing you, by the way, if you're like, well, like Lebanese leaders indirectly urge Hezbollah to stay out. It's like, well, does Hezbollah operate on the behest of the, Lebanese government? No, they have their own type of leaders. That's what I was saying, how Lebanon is such a complicated situation because they have these different competing military and political groups.
Hezbollah to stay out of the crisis, and at least until now, Hezbollah has chosen to remain on the sidelines. The group actually has issued statements condemning Israel's attacks against Iran, but it hasn't made any mention of conducting a response of its own. Similarly, one of Iran's largest proxy militias in Iraq, known as Kataib Hezbollah, has declined to make any movements against Israel. Both groups, as well as Hamas, have threatened that they could retaliate against the United States if it gets involved, which America hasn't done at the time of writing. That's something's going to change by the time you see this video, though. I just looked at the news. But for now...
Yeah, so again, he's looking at this probably. What was the date on that? I mean, it said 10 hours ago, but this is within the last couple days. And then, today, this 2-week thing kind of got promoted or proposed, where the U.S. is going to analyze this over the next 2 weeks and try to do like a study with their, the advisors and things about what effectiveness could the United States have? Is it necessary? I think it's really both of those questions right now. So we'll see. But I mean, things can change day to day. You never know. The biggest thing that, of course, would be the game changers if there was a strike on anything American, whether it's ships or bases in the region. I mean, that would amplify it and put it to the forefront immediately. But I don't know if there's any indication of that right now.
But for now, Iran, neither they nor Iran's other proxy militias in Syria or Iraq have stepped up. Even the new Syrian government, which now doesn't support Iran but is dealing with Israeli occupation on its own soil, has refused to go so far as even verbally condemning Israel's actions. Instead, Israel has been using Syria's airspace for free to launch its strikes, giving a clear indication of just how reticent armed actors have become in opposing Israel when they know they might end up in the crosshairs. Right now, the ongoing devastation of Iran's ruling regime is quite clearly a defeat in progress. Iran might still have some tricks up its sleeve, but regardless, the country has now suffered a degree of losses that can never be taken back, and it appears entirely unlikely to be able to match, with its own military strikes, Israel. But
if you've heard too, Tehran, President Trump he put out that post or whatever that said, everyone in Tehran needs to evacuate. And it looks like that's actually happened. I mean, it's a massive city. It's their capital, and people are leaving in droves to leave the city. And that's a big thing they're going to have to deal with there. So, when you have those types of things, what becomes interesting is who are the type of people to stay behind when evacuations happen. Now, usually what that is often the most radical of people, right? And then they become the power in that place that was being vacated, and then that power, if they aren't destroyed, are the ones that end up taking control. And that can happen if Iranians, for example, leave the country. If you have a lot of more like moderate Iranians, maybe some of them are like, we don't want to stay here because our government is, acting crazy or something like that, and they're just going to get us all killed, and they're all going to leave. And again, what ends up happening is the people that stay are your most radical and extreme, and they're the ones that really get to maintain power. That happens, and we see that in history. So would that then threaten the idea of a potential grassroots movement to overthrow the ruling body of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is something that like Israel would really wants. I mean, Netanyahu was putting out statements trying to tell Iranians like, you know, like our fight is with your leadership, like we want to be friends with you. Time for a regime change or something like that. But it's very difficult to make a regime change when two things are happening, which is happening right now. First, people are leaving, but then also that there's destruction. It's hard to bomb somebody into you liking them and getting friendship. You can still have resentment for that. But then again, there's going to be people that are going to be further hardened by this and give more support to their leaders. So you're probably going to see, because again, we saw this. We saw it in Afghanistan, we saw it in Iraq, that things can go a whole bunch of different ways. Saw it in Syria as well, with all the people that left Syria. And what ends up happening is radical groups can remain or topple pre-existing groups.
The collapse of highly unlikely to be able to match with its own military strikes Israel. But the collapse of Iran's proxy networks, known collectively as the Axis of
Still want to hear him
Resistance,
talk
represents
about
an even greater strategic failure for Tehran and
other
the
countries.
Ayatollah. For decades, every action that Iran has taken to oppose or undermine Israel has rested on a single predicate: that the threat presented by the Axis of Resistance was too great for Israel to launch direct, large-scale military action. For Iran, the question wasn't whether Israel or Iran would win in a head-to-head contest, but whether Israel would judge the costs of a military offensive inflicted by both Iran and the Axis of Resistance to outweigh the potential benefits for Jerusalem.
Well, one of the differences, I guess, between some of the border-sharing nations with Israel and with Iran is this wouldn't be a colonizing type of movement that's maybe happening in a place like Gaza or southern Lebanon or part of Syria, because we've seen that type of action happen ever since the creation of Israel. So with Iran, is it simply just going to be about possibly, again, two things: utter destruction of the nuclear development program or a regime change to the clerical leadership of the Islamic Republic of Iran? That's where it becomes different, because there's not going to be some like direct colonization of Iran by Israel.
Both Iran and the Axis of Resistance to outweigh the potential benefits for Jerusalem. But after the October 7th attack by Hamas, Israel has engaged in a campaign to systematically dismantle each of Iran's proxies, some of which have been wiped out more thoroughly than others, but none of which currently retain the ability to strike Israel at scale. The Axis of Resistance is not destroyed, at least not yet, but it's been taken so far out of fighting form that it no longer poses a threat. And month by month, operation by operation, Israel has shown Iran that its grand efforts across the Middle East were a waste of time. In the case of Hamas, the broader twists and turns of Middle Eastern diplomacy were able to force a rushed attack without Iran's direct support, devastating and tragic for Israel, but ultimately something that Jerusalem could endure.
I wonder what he's just saying waste of time. Waste of time in, I guess, what sense? If it was a waste of time that they're going to like lead to the collapse of the Israeli state, or just the fact that their proxies are not having the success, I guess, that they would want. Vulnerability has been shown. I mean, that has been something. And we also know that right now, support for Israel is at an all-time low. You look at the polls and things that have come out recently. I know a recent Pew poll has put the Republican Party about 50% in the United States, at least. And then with the Democratic Party, that's up another 10 to 15%. So that puts it at just over 50% not being in full support of Israel. Just barely. What was it, 52, 53? I think the recent Pew poll came out with. So that has been one, I guess, effect that we have never seen that type of attitude change towards Israel probably since the creation of it, at least not by the Western world. Their support is at an all-time low.
After the initial assault, Israel proved that it was willing to invade Gaza outright, dismantle Hamas, and devastate the Gaza Strip in the process, crossing several lines that Iran seemed to believe it wouldn't. When it was time to deal with Hezbollah, and then with Iran directly, Israel demonstrated the incredible depth of penetration that its foreign intelligence service, Mossad, had achieved. For Hezbollah, that demonstration came by way of explosive pagers and handheld radios. In Iran, it came by way of smuggled explosive drones, targeted assassinations on the ground, and a large-scale sabotage campaign.
A lot of covert operations.
Intelligence about the movements of Iran's leaders. When it came to the Houthis, Israel proved itself willing to go to far greater lengths than a US-led coalition in destroying the group's attack capabilities. And when it came to Syria, Israel bided its time, let the rebel coalition do its work, and then destroyed Syria's military hardware so thoroughly that Damascus couldn't stop Israeli flyovers, even if it wanted to. For Iran and its proxy network, the result is a practically total defeat. Incredible sums of money have been thrown away to armed groups that couldn't hold their own, when they could have been spent building up Iran's home defenses. High volumes of missiles and drones have been shipped all across the region, only for most of them to be destroyed before they could launch. The work of Iran's military advisors, its logistical units, and its propagandists have come to nothing. And now Iran itself is practically helpless to defend against the same Israeli military that has knocked down its allies, one after the next after the next. Yeah. Israel's military victories in this conflict will be studied for a generation, but perhaps just as worthy of study is the resounding failure of Iran's long-term strategy. While it lasted, it was a hell of a gamble, using an approach that no other nation has relied on to any level anywhere near what Iran chose to do. But now that the axis of resistance has collapsed, it's entirely clear in hindsight. That strategy was not enough to save Iran, and
I don't even know if it was a strategy,
it led
though.
to Iran's undoing. And that's where we end today's episode. I'd like to give a big shout out again, like I did yesterday, to Evan, who works at night to get these done. Shout out Evan, and also Jen, who I'm about to send this across to, who edits these videos and gets them out somehow by the end of the day. I'm recording this early in the morning, and it'll be done. So let them know in the comments, give them some love, and we'll be back.
Final thoughts. All right, so where I guess I'm unsure when listening to what Simon was saying was how much Iran really thought that these groups were going to help in any way be like defensive in nature to Iran. I don't know. I can't imagine that they were really thinking that would be the case. If anything, yeah, they can do smaller invasions for a reason that Iran really wanted to put on an offensive. So I don't know about that, but I was hoping, and he didn't, though, talk about other countries outside of the Islamic world, and those places are going to be, even less likely to jump in. Like I've said in the last couple of videos, China, Russia basically want nothing to do with it. So if you're talking other type of foreign powers, there's not much that's going to be coming in the way of Iran here. But it still comes back to the question of what is going to be the goal here for Israel, and by extension, the Americans. And it brings in important questions that are probably more difficult than many think of, which is like, okay, what is the goal? How do you know you've achieved it? And how do you know that it will be long-term in your favorability, right? Otherwise, does this become, for the Americans, Iraq 2.0, Afghanistan 2.0? Do we see further destabilization in this area? Is it going to just rinse and repeat the miscalculations, overall long-term failures that came with those conflicts? Because in the present, it's very easy to imagine these scenarios in a way that you think will look good, but in reality, it doesn't work like that. And I know it's a cliche phrase, but you've heard that those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. So do you think this conflict could end up being one of those things that repeats in history? Or is there a reason that this is different? You can speculate. What do you think? Let me know down below. All right.